I was just saying I'm like somebody's grandmother up here. Like I've got my handbag, I've got my book. I don't have a plastic bag, but close. Very close. Anyway, thank you all for being here. This is a typical, increasingly typical American Enterprise Institute event in which we have a small but treasured and beloved audience and a much larger audience online. And so we do Q&A. And so just FYI, I'm not shopping online when I pick up the iPad, unless you're really boring. And I don't think you're going to be because I've heard you talk about this great book. Everybody knows Elliott Abrams. A good friend of ours, a good friend of AEI's. He is a senior fellow for Middle East Studies, although you do a lot on Venezuela there too. At the Council on Foreign Relations, he's chairman of the Tikva Fund. I hope we're going to talk a little bit about what Tikva does too, because I love it. He previously served as deputy assistant to the president, deputy national security advisor. I'm not going to go through your whole resume. You know it. You can look it up if you don't know it. Let's talk about this. I have my first important question for you. Why did you write this book?
Well, first, thank you all for being here, including those of you online. Thank you for hosting this. Why did I write the book? Oddly, perhaps, for the same reason I wrote its predecessor, Faith or Fear, in 1997. People do these big surveys of the American Jewish community. In that case, it was the National Jewish Population Survey, which found a lot of things, and people were making lots of comments, and institutions were, and I thought, much of this is not right. I should talk about this. In this case, it was Pew, the Pew Research Center, which did Jewish Americans in 2020, which is a very large survey and has a lot of useful information. But if I can put it this way, Pew's take on their own survey was wrong. It was kind of, isn't this wonderful? 7.5 million Jews, and the community's growing, and everything is terrific. And I read the report, and I looked at the data, and I thought, this is completely wrong. This is not a great story, and I should explain this.
Why is it not a great story? You left us hanging.
Yes, because there's a lot of erosion, I guess is the word I'd use, in the American Jewish community. There's a positive side to this story, which is this is a great country. What would you expect in an open society that's about 2.4% Jewish? Jews assimilate into the broader society. Here's an example. According to Pew, there are 2.4 million children, 2.4 million children living in a home with 2 Jewish parents or 1 Jewish parent. How many of those children are being raised as Jews? Not as Christians, not as Jews and Christians, not as nothing, just as Jews. Half. Now, that's not a story of success. That's not a story of growth, because there'll be substantial erosion or loss among those children. There are other numbers I could cite. I actually do want to cite one more, again, that comes from Pew. Pew asks the question, is it important to you? Is it somewhat important? Is it very important that your grandchildren are Jews? And for very important, yes, it's very important to me that my grandchildren are Jews. 1/3 of American Jews. Well, if it's not very important to you, again, this is a great open society with a tiny Jewish minority. And if it's not very important to you, it's unlikely to happen, or much less likely to happen. So these, and there are many more numbers like this, that are numbers that suggest that in the non-Orthodox part of the American Jewish community, which today is the Orthodox part's about 10%. For the rest, the erosion will continue. And Pew, in that sense, gives the wrong impression about the American Jewish community. And I will, let me just say a couple more things. One, this is all self-reporting for Pew in this massive survey. That is, how do they know if somebody's Jewish? Because they said, are you Jewish? And if you say yes, and the question they ask is, are you Jewish in any way? That means that some of the people who say, yeah, sure, mean that, well, grandpa, one of 4 grandparents was Jewish. So, I mean, you said in any way, so it's meaningless. I think for many of the people who answered yes to Pew, the only thing they have ever done that suggests a Jewish identity is they said yeah to the Pew caller. There's an interesting story by Sergio della Pergola, who's really the greatest Jewish demographer of our day, who's at the Hebrew University. And he was born in Trieste. And he made the comment about the Pew survey, actually. Okay, that's a fact. I was born in Trieste. It's on all my papers. My children know, my grandchildren know that they have this ancestor born in Trieste. What is the meaning of it? It's a fact. It doesn't mean anything. It doesn't tell you anything about his children or his grandchildren or his relationship to Trieste or to Italy. He hasn't been to Trieste in 30 years, he says. So that, I think, is the problem with much of this data, that it's not false, but doesn't mean anything.
Right. So what does it mean to be a Jew? Just diving in with the easy questions
right.
up front. And we haven't even touched politics.
What does it mean? Well, I think there are 2 definitions. One is the religious definition. There is a religion, Judaism, and you either are an adherent of that religion or you're not. There's another definition, which is the definition of what let's call peoplehood. The definitions blur, particularly in Israel. That is, if you are an Israeli Jew who's quite secular, you're still a Jew. And in fact, you can be pretty sure that your grandchildren are going to be Jews. The definition is different in the diaspora. And the relationship between Judaism and Jewish peoplehood is a complex question. Many people, I think, many American Jews would say, well, let me start that again. Pew actually does something interesting. They divide their respondents into JBRs and JNRs, Jews by religion and Jews of no religion. That's a very interesting Jews of no religion. So they are expressing the view, which is the view of many people who, in the survey, that you can be a Jew without practicing Judaism by doing other things. Now, again, I think the Pew definition, which is, if you raise your hand, then that's all that counts. But one can imagine, let's say, an American Jewish family that's not really religious, but they go to Israel every year and they donate to Jewish community charities and they give their children a strong Jewish education and they send their children to a Jewish summer camp, let's say. Okay, that's a Jewish family, even though they may have really no religious practice at all. So the relationship between the religion and the peoplehood, again, in the diaspora particularly, I think it's a complicated one. I would draw a parallel here to Catholics in the United States. If you think of Hollywood movies, 30s, 40s, the golden age of Hollywood, you will see a lot of Irish and Italian families, immigrant families, everybody with 9 children, and the parents with accents. Those families don't exist anymore. But the children of those families are what's known nowadays as cradle Catholics, a strong Catholic culture, no matter what they believe. How about their children? Their children have the same lack of belief, but they're not cradle Catholics. What do they have? I mean, the Catholics of no religion? Maybe. And actually, Ross Douthat in the New York Times has written about this as a believing Catholic himself, that this is a problem in the Catholic community too. Different community in part because of the in-migration to the United States of lots of particularly Latino Catholics. But for Jews, it's a very hard balance to maintain in the United States. I think in the non-Orthodox community, there are different levels of connection to the religion. For 50 or 75 years, there's been this expression, the revolving door Jew, that is in at Rosh Hashanah and out at Yom Kippur, just celebrating the high holidays. Nevertheless, I mean, one can laugh about that, but okay, those people went to synagogue twice a year. That's 2 times more than 0. They probably belong to a synagogue. Their kids may well have some Jewish education. I think the idea that one can maintain Jewish peoplehood in the US without doing something very intentional is a mistake. It was not a mistake for the immigrant generations who lived in a kind of immersive Jewish culture. My grandparents, who emigrated here from Europe, spoke Yiddish, spoke English, but not well, and read English poorly. And their children grew up with those parents. Now, I grew up knowing those grandparents, but my children really didn't, and my grandchildren. So that kind of ethnic experience has disappeared, and the dense Jewish communities have disappeared. They were enforced partly by antisemitism. So if you think of I remember when I was a kid, my parents would sometimes we'd drive by a hotel and they'd say, that hotel is restricted, no Jews. Well, that sort of began to disappear after World War II, and that kind of social segregation, corporate segregation, pretty much gone. So I guess the central argument I make in the book to American Jews is, if you care, I'm not lecturing people, if you say to me, I don't care, I just don't care. I don't care if my children are Jews, I don't care if my grandchildren are. I don't know how to argue with such a person. I can yell at such a person, but I can't argue. But if you care, you as a parent or grandparent, you as a donor, you as an official of some Jewish organization, then there are things that can be done and that have to be done, because it isn't going to be, Jewishness is not going to be absorbed by osmosis because of the neighborhood and the social networks in which non-Orthodox American Jews live. If you care about it, you've got to create it. Create it, I argue, by Jewish education, by Jewish summer camps, which is quite wholly immersive Jewish experience, and by time in Israel, which is also an immersive Jewish experience. And the more time, the better. I mean, Birthright has been proved to have positive impact, and that's 10 days, or as I like to put it, 10 lousy days, and it changes people's lives. So think of high school semester, gap year, junior year abroad. Those will have even more impact.
So we were talking in the green room about Ruth Weiss, and we had, not long after October 7th, 2023. I can't believe this is ongoing, but we had her on our podcast with Mark Thiessen and I, and I talked about the decline of Holocaust education. And Ruth, as is her wont, jumped down my throat. And we had this conversation again when she spoke here as a guest at AEI. She is very hostile to the idea of the Jew as victim. But of course, the Jew as victim is one of the things that actually propels Jewish identity and forces this affinity. I mean, what is this Jewish awakening that's happened, Jewish and Zionist awakening that's happened since October 7th, if not a reaction to that? How do we square this?
I'm with Ruth on this. I think we've now had 50 years of Holocaust education. You go back, Jimmy Carter appoints the Commission on Holocaust, and the museum gets created. So it starts in the Carter administration 50 years ago. And now, there are courses on the Holocaust in lots of colleges and universities. There are something like 25 Holocaust museums. I mean, half the states have a Holocaust museum, and more than half the states, I think it's about 38 now, have Holocaust education as a requirement in public schools. And I think that sitting here today, we can say it failed. It all failed. Has it reduced the amount of anti-Semitism? I don't know, looking around in the last year, it's, I think, difficult to say that it's had that impact. What has it done? I'm really quite dubious. It presents the Jew as victim. And I'm with Ruth in saying that that's not a good picture to present. I don't think it's good for Jews, and for Jews as Jews, and I don't think it's good for Jews in the broader community. So, point one. Point two, I'm really dubious about this wave of the Zionism and recommitment to Judaism. Nathan Glazer, in his great book, American Judaism, I'm gonna almost quote this sentence. The two largest events of the 20th century for Jews, the Holocaust and the formation of the State of Israel, had almost no impact on American Judaism, he said. Look at the 67 war, and there were lots of quotes, 67 and 73. This will change the American Jewish community forever. It didn't change anything. Neither of them changed anything. Any trend you can point to pre-67 continues post-67. There's a blip in that year. Many more contributions to Israel bonds. There are more philanthropy. And I think we're going to see that now. Yes, there has been an increase. That's certainly the impressionistic evidence. You ask rabbis, they will tell you, I've had more people come in the last 12 months to say, I want to convert. These are usually people in an intermarriage who have decided now to convert than I had in the previous year. I don't really believe any of this. And there's a little bit of evidence. I won't read the quotations, but there was a study by a sociologist at Tufts, Eitan Hirsch, on campuses. Because you have a lot of this evidence that, many Jewish students have been invigorated, energized by the battles that they now face on campus. And what Hirsch finds is completely predictable, that how you react to all this stuff on campus depends on what you came to campus with. So who are the Israel activists on campus? They are the kids with what he calls high Jewish background. That is, their family belonged to a synagogue. They themselves had a bar or bat mitzvah. They had some Jewish education. The great majority have been to Israel. I think it's 73% have been to Israel. In the American Jewish community as a whole, 45% have been to Israel even once. This is much higher. And shocker of shockers, they looked at Jewish students who were out there campaigning against Israel. And they have, according to Professor Hirsch, low Jewish background. Why is this surprising? It's not. So what you're finding is that kids who have a pretty healthy Jewish identity get to campus and they confront bigotry, anti-Semitism, Hamas demonstrations, and they react strongly and they say, we have to do something about this. Let's get active, let's get organized. And kids who don't have that background, you know, that's not me. That's going on the other side of the campus.
Yeah, no, I see that. I see that at Georgetown all the time. I wanna ask you about this, and we talked about it a little at the outset, but the prescriptions in your book are, well, Jewish education. Okay, that's religious because Jewish education is up to a point. Jewish summer camp, which having gone for 1 year to Camp Grossman, it stunk. Oh God, it's just like a movie from the 1980s. It was really not amazing. And going to Israel. None of those things are expressly oriented around God or faith.
Yeah, you know, that's right. And tactically, my view was that if you say to people who are non-religious, I tell you what you need to do. You need to get religious. Okay, well, here's what you need to do. Start going to synagogue every week, minimum on Shabbat. Kosher, you gotta be kosher from now on. Make your home kosher, start eating, et cetera, et cetera. I think the resistance is, you're not going to get anywhere.
Can I interrupt you,
yeah,
Joe?
yeah.
But of course, I totally agree with you. But I mean, isn't the other weakness here that your local synagogue isn't going to help you one damn bit either with this process?
It varies. I think, as a generalization, I'd agree with that. But you know, if you look at, for example, the conservative movement, Jewish conservative movement, I mean, the denomination, it's declining. Nevertheless, I can point you to a good number of really vibrant synagogues where some are terrible and have closed. Others are growing. Membership is growing. They're doing something right. And they will help you. So I think, you know, it's interesting. I asked the question about an Orthodox day school in Manhattan. How many of the families are actually Orthodox? And the answer was less than half. And that's because these are parents who say, well, I want my children to be Jewish. And I think probably the best way to do it is not only a good Jewish education, but in a milieu where their friends, their classmates are also going to be doing the same sorts of things. Now, it's not religious in the sense that the motivation is really peoplehood, not, let's call it Judaism. But it works, and it will have that impact. Now, on summer camp, I would just say there are good statistics.
I have them right here.
If you look, and why? It's an immersive experience, and you have role models. You're 10, you're 12. There's a counselor, and he's a big teenager, and that's a good role model for you. And most Jewish summer camps now have Israeli counselors as well. There's another role model for you. And if you look at American Jewish institutions, organizations, a lot of the staffs were counselors. So I think, pardon me, Jewish summer camps really can play a role. And there's another reason why I push that. I think the barriers to entry for Jewish day schools for most non-Orthodox American Jews are very high. Demand among Orthodox Jews is inelastic. Your kids have to go there. But demand among non-Orthodox Jews, quite elastic. They don't have to go there. And it's really expensive.
Yeah.
And there's a free alternative, public school. And if you have the money, there's another good alternative, private school. Well, the summer's different. I mean, for most American Jewish families, what do you do with the kids during the summer? They got to do something. As it turns out, participation in Jewish summer camping is in the middle 2 quartiles. That's where it's highest. Why? In the top quartile, people have other options. You have a summer home. The family goes to Europe for a month. In the lower quartile, they can't afford it. So it's the second and third quartile where participation is highest. And that, I mention that because for philanthropists, there's a job to do, enable more kids to go to summer camp. I think it's much more plausible, than saying, oh, you should go to Jewish day school. And it's a lot cheaper.
Yeah, that's for sure. What about Israel? I asked you this question at another book event, but I mean, living in Israel per se, or visiting Israel per se, it doesn't necessarily enhance your Jewish identity. I mean, you go to the Israel Museum, you see the Dead Sea Scrolls, amazing. You go to the Dead Sea, that's not too much Jew about that. In fact, it's really itchy, so maybe that is the reaction of a Jew. But in Masada, et cetera, why, in your view, is this an integral part? Or are you reverse engineering from people who feel more Jewish because they've been? What's the reasoning behind it?
The reasoning behind it is partly depends on the experience we're talking about. For example, if you do junior year abroad or a high school semester abroad or a gap year in Israel, then presumably, not always, you have a good opportunity to learn Hebrew, which gives you an access to that society, pardon me, that you would not otherwise have. You're going to meet a lot of Israelis. You're going to meet a lot of Israelis your own age. You're going to see something, this is particularly true of college kids. You are 19, let's say. What are you concerned about? American Jewish kid. As I put it at that other book event, ultimate frisbee, probably your university's football team. And if you go to Israel, you will meet 19-year-old Israelis who are trying to figure out whether they will be alive tomorrow because they're in the army or their brother or sister is in the army or their cousin is or their father is in the reserves and he's now in Gaza. That's an experience that I think can be a real education for diaspora Jewish kids. But there's another reason. If your parents and you, or if I can say your parents have taken you to London, to Los Angeles, assuming you live in the East, or New York if you live in LA, if you've been to, you've been on vacation to Cuernavaca, you've been on a Mediterranean cruise, and they've never taken you to Israel, you're learning something, which is they don't care. It isn't of any importance to them, or they do it. Maybe they've never even been, or they went once, they went 20 years ago for 5 days. I think it's analogous in a way to the Hebrew school issue. That is, if your parents tell you you have to go to Hebrew school, why? Because you have to be bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah. You have to do this. Okay, so you go to Hebrew school. Your parents care a lot about your grades in public school. They don't seem to care at all about your grades in Hebrew school. And they drop you off and pick you up. And they never set foot in the synagogue. You are learning a lot. about what they think is important. And I think for a Jewish parent to say to a Jewish child, it's important for us to go to Israel. It's important for you to go to Israel, to get to know that country, because it's part of our lives. It's the capital of every Jew. And now, of course, the majority of Jews in the world live in Israel. I think if you don't convey that, if you convey to your kid, it just doesn't matter to me. It's of no concern. Half the Jews in the world live there. Well, so I think the messaging is absorbed and is very important.
No, I agree about that, actually. I want to talk about Israel, and to talk about the politics around Israel and Zionism, but I want to ask you one last question about American Jews, and we have a couple from the audience as well that I want to ask you. But what do we do about? I mean, it seems to me that the greatest threat, and you know something about me that will make this question even more ironic, the greatest threat to the Jewish religion in America is intermarriage. And intermarriage rates, I heard you with the
Over
statistics.
70%.
Over 70%.
For non-Orthodox Jews.
Yeah. How do you fix that?
Well, you don't, to use your verb, fix it. It's now over 70%. And there's a lot of, let's call it loss there. That is, of couples who decide that the children will not be raised Jewish. Very few of the people raised that way find their way back to Judaism or Jewish. It's not zero. But, think of it this way. How you're trying to create a sense of peoplehood, of Jewish identity, but half the family isn't Jewish. There's a grandma and grandpa who aren't Jewish. There are aunts, uncles, and cousins who aren't Jewish. There may be Christmas. There may be Easter. So it's hard. Now, we're talking now about intermarriage, and by definition, that means without conversion. Because if the non-Jewish partner converts, that's not an intermarriage. The rates, the statistics for marriages where one partner converted to Judaism are almost indistinguishable in every way from two born Jews marrying each other. For example, do you belong to a synagogue? Do you ever go to synagogue? Do you celebrate Jewish holidays? Have you ever been to Israel? All this sort of thing. It's almost exactly the same, and sometimes a little better. Because many people who convert take it quite seriously. Where you get a different number, not surprising, how many of your friends, what percentage of your friends are Jews? And I think the answer to that is that people get married today in their 30s, not the day they graduate from college. And so, people live in America. And that explains, I think, partly explains the intermarriage rate itself, because if you live in America, 2% of the eligible partners for you are going to be Jews, and 98% are not. But I think, what can the Jewish community do? Number one, be very open be very pro-conversion. Very difficult to do. As I was writing the book, talking to people, you talk to, say, the parent of the Jewish child who intermarried, who will say, I can't raise it, it's a terribly sensitive subject, and that's clearly correct in most cases. So all you can do, I think, is say, be very, very supportive of conversion and of the participation of the child in any Jewish activity. Now that's been very controversial it was much more than it is now. But go back, say when I wrote the first book, 1997, so look at the 1990s. There was an argument, there still is, but it was more prominent. No, do not encourage the participation, because what you're doing is saying intermarriage is fine. I think most Jewish organizations today, most synagogues, not Orthodox synagogues, but all the rest, are saying, look, with intermarriage rates of 70+%, we should be welcoming any child or parent who comes through the door and expresses an interest. And let's see if we can foster that interest and build on that interest and build the child's sense of Jewish identity.
Yeah. The root of my synagogue question, but also this problem, when we moved to McLean, I went to Rodef, where my girls went to summer camp and to nursery school, and we walked in the door. It was right before Pesach, Passover, and we found a person, and I asked, "What do you need to do to come to services?" And they were like, "What? Who are you?" No, you can't.
Yeah,
My husband looked at me and said, "Is this what all synagogues are like?" Because if that's true, I certainly understand why your ranks are not growing.
You know, we, Tikva, the Tikva Fund, of which I'm chairman, opened our own school in Manhattan just now in September called Emmett Classical Academy. Many of you may know that there are a lot of Catholic and evangelical classical schools around the country. This is the first Jewish classical school. We teach Hebrew and Latin and try to convey the greatness of the Jewish tradition and of the Western tradition, Greece and Rome. I raise it now because one of the questions we had to ask ourselves when we were planning this school is, what about religion? What about intermarriage? What about all of this? And the answer we came up with was, we're not asking that question. We have a morning prayer at 8 before school starts. Everybody's welcome. If you want to participate, you participate. But we do not ask, well, now wait a minute, who married whom, and how does this, and do you ever go that? Which you know, I don't criticize it for Orthodox schools to ask, well, are you Orthodox? Although, as I said, in many cases the answer is no. But we decided, no, anybody who wants to try this experiment, Jewish classical education, you're welcome. Come on in.
No, that's great. Let's talk quickly before we open up to the audience about the person who always comes to mind. Yes, politics is Donald Trump, right? Saying, you know, Jews ought to be voting for him, except he said it in a much more vulgar way, although not from a garbage truck at least. But let's talk about the politics. You know, more than 80% of American Jews identify as Zionists. But very few American Jews vote on either Zionist or Israel or Jewish related issues. How does this all fit in?
First,
especially post October 7th.
Yeah. What people mean when they identify as Zionist is unclear. Pew asked a different question, which is, do you feel very attached to Israel? Do you feel somewhat attached to Israel? Do you feel not at all attached to Israel? For Jews under 30, 48% said they were very or somewhat attached to Israel. That's really a bad number. So 52% said not even somewhat attached. That's really striking. Why don't Jews vote this way? Well, we could go on for about 11 hours on this question, but
yes.
First, I would say, for a lot of time, there wasn't much to choose from in the two parties as to their attitude toward Israel. There were many elections when both parties seemed equally supportive. Once upon a time, the Republicans were less supportive than the Democrats. This would be true, say, in the Eisenhower administration. I do spend some time in the book pointing in the wrong direction, talking about the U.S.-Israel relationship, which was much frostier than we now remember.
Right.
I mean, I think a lot of people read the closeness of today back 25, 50, 75 years, completely untrue. But the Republicans began to shift toward Israel, and there was a point then when you could vote on anything you wanted to vote on. Israel wasn't really, administration coming in was going to be okay. Now there is a diminution in support for Israel in a number of communities, particularly among people under 30. It's true among evangelicals. We can debate why, but it's a fact. Younger evangelicals are much less supportive of Israel than their parents, grandparents were. It's true for Jews, and it's true for Democrats, taken as a whole. And the party split, the partisan split, I've got the numbers in the book, is remarkable. It's not a fluke. It goes back certainly a decade, and in poll after poll after poll, there is a tremendous partisan split now in support for Israel, in who do you feel closer to, Israelis or Palestinians? Who do you feel more supportive of? Questions about, who is responsible for the war, this war, a tremendous partisan split. So why doesn't that affect the way Jews vote? Well, there are a number of theories. One, for me as a Republican, the most promising theory, it's a time lag. As time goes by, more and more Jews will see that the Democratic Party is moving away from support for Israel. If that's true, there is the squad. We sit here in Washington, take a look at the trajectory of, for example, Senator Van Hollen.
Oh my God.
Or even Senator Kaine in Virginia.
Yep.
Much less supportive than he used to be. Okay, will that have an impact? I would look at one thing in this election. I think many American Jews are very put off by President Trump's style. That shouldn't affect the way they vote for House and Senate candidates. And I think that's going to be a very interesting thing to watch. For example, McCormick in Pennsylvania, Moreno in Ohio. I'm not making predictions. I'm just saying it's something interesting to watch. What percent of Jewish voters, however they vote for president, change their votes for the House or Senate? So that's one answer. Maybe it will change over time. A second answer would be, well, look at this, the number I read out. A lot of American Jews don't care much about Israel. I think that's true. A lot don't. Now, is it 20% who just don't really care much? Is it 30%? Whatever the number is. These are people who are, I would argue, disaffiliating from their Jewish identity and from the American Jewish community. So it's not surprising that though they may in some sense be counted as Jewish voters, well, Judaism and Jewishness are just not important in their lives. So why would you expect them to vote, for that reason? And for other Jews, I would only say they may care, but they care more about other things. Right. There is a split between Jewish men and women. Jewish men vote Republican more than Jewish women. According to the polls, the issue seems to be abortion, though Jewish women very rarely get abortions. But it's a big political factor.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. It really is. But I mean, what's interesting to me, I had this yet again thrown at me in a discussion about the election on foreign policy, where someone said, Kamala Harris's husband is Jewish. I was just like, so what? Governor Pritzker in Illinois is
Yeah.
Jewish. It took him 4 days to say anything, and he still hasn't called for the school, the
shooting,
openly
yeah.
anti-Semitic, the shooting, but also the
Yeah.
school chancellor.
Oh,
to,
yes,
not
yeah.
to not to step down.
Yes.
All right,
Yeah.
let's open it up to questions. And I have some online, but you've got your hand up right in front of me, so perfect. Just wait for the mic. One of two mics, no less. And do identify yourself, please.
Yep, I'm Manny Cohen. I work at AEI. I'm a comms assistant. So one question that I had is that something that's been amplified over the past year, I've noticed it with a couple of people I know, is kind of these rise of people that say that they're strongly Jewish and with whatever that means to them, but they're anti-Israel.
Right.
And my question is those kids will presumably grow up and have children at some point one day. And would you prescribe kind of the same solutions to them when they might say, I don't want to send my kid to Israel for a year or something like that?
Well, I guess there is the hope that they won't be, when they are older and more responsible, better educated, have children, they won't be the idiots they are today. Sorry to put it that way, but the statistics that I've seen suggest that that's not so common. And you may have come across the phrase, I think it's the journalist Eli Lake who has written best about this, the as a Jew. What is an as a Jew? It's a person who doesn't do anything with regard to his or her religion or Jewish identity except attack Israel. And that identity is invoked exclusively for the as a Jew. I think that that exists, but it's a phony. It is instrumentalizing or weaponizing Jewish identity for one purpose. I'm generalizing, and I know of, I make these recommendations in the book. I certainly know of Jewish families that have done everything you can think of. Really, let's put it this way, good Jewish families observe Shabbat and they belong to synagogues, they're active, and the son or daughter on campus is out there campaigning for Hamas, basically. But that's statistically not so common. And I also think we should distinguish between being anti-Israel and being critical of the government. I have lots of friends who are critical of Netanyahu, who don't like this government, who think it's a right-wing government, much too far right. For some of those people and their parents, if Netanyahu is not prime minister in 2 years, they'll get over it. And one of the things that they'll find out if they don't know it is that the left of center parties in Israel, like the Labor Party, are going to have essentially the same foreign policy. The same Iran policy, the same Gaza policy, the same West Bank policy, the same Lebanon policy. And we'll see what they make of that. But I think this phenomenon of really being anti-Israel is rare for students raised with, again, what the Hearst study called a strong high Jewish background.
Back here.
Hi, I'm Kyle Olson. I run the travel team at CNN Underscored, and I have a question for you about Jewish identity. Earlier this month, there was a story in the New York Times, it was an opinion piece by Bret Stephens called "The Year the American Jews Woke Up." And the central theme of this article is generally Jews in America, younger generation, have sort of taken a community in the left democratic sphere, but now they don't have a place to go because on university campuses, so on, they're divided. What would you say to that generation and to that group of people?
You say first, I think he's exaggerating the phenomenon, as I said. I think you could have written that about Jews in America in 1967, and it petered out in the course of a year or two. So I'm not sure. But what would I say to the students? I would say to them, this would probably not go over all that well, but I would say, think about the possibility that at 18, 19, maybe even 20, you actually don't know as much as you think you do about world politics and about the Middle East. Think about the possibility that what you know about it is wrong because you've been instructed by very far left-wing professors, 99% of whom are left of center and are extremely critical of Israel. That must have some impact on what they teach you. Think about the fact that you don't understand Israel very well, and that your exact counterparts in Israel are fighting and dying for their country. Why are they fighting and dying for a vicious, despicable, brutal apartheid state? They're not. Maybe they know something you don't. Do you know about their life experience and about the history of that country and its society well enough? Do you know enough to make the judgments that you seem to be making now? And my hope would be that at least some of them would say, let's talk about that. Obviously, many would scream back and actually would have prevented me from even getting to the campus, right? But there's always this question. When you look at these numbers for people who are under 30, are they going to be that way when they're 60? Or does life change you? Does having a job, having a child, having a spouse change the way you look at some of these things? I hope so.
Yeah, I hope so too. Hello back there, and then I'm going to take 2 online questions.
Thank you. Hillel Fradkin of the Hudson Institute. Thanks, Elliott. Thanks, Danny. The question I want to ask is a very unfair one, but it lurks behind these things, which is, put crudely, you put Judaism on the table and Israel on the table, and the question that could easily be raised is, why either of them? Why should one care? And I have certainly my own reasons for thinking one should, but I'm just wondering to what degree that question is being addressed or has to be addressed at this point. I'll leave Judaism aside because that would be much more complicated. But on the question of Israel, there was, I think, a time when the presentation of Israel was partially was always presented as, we need this place because they'll kill us if we don't have a place to defend ourselves from. But there was another side of the Zionist movement which said it was really a noble endeavor, a truly noble endeavor, and not only for our own ennoblement, but for the ennoblement of the world. And it seems to me that, in part, one would have to make that argument at this point, but I don't see it actually being made anymore. But my experience perhaps is too limited to know what's going on.
Well, part of the argument, I think, is being made. Let's leave the religion narrowly defined. Let's leave religious questions out of this. In order to defend Israel, in public debate, you have to describe it. So in describing it, I think you are, in a sense, addressing the question of why should a non-Jewish American care. It's a separate question. Although there's an overlap with Jews, because you have to be describing a society, as I was saying before. No, it's not an apartheid nation. It's in fact an amazing ingathering of exiles of different races from all over the world. it's a vibrant democracy, and so on. You have to make those arguments. You have to ask, I should have actually said this before in addressing our imaginary college student. What does it tell you about a society that it is the only society of any country in the OECD that has a more than replacement birth rate? We don't. We're okay because of immigration. But what does it tell you about the people and their faith in their society, their country, their future? I mean, these are the arguments that one, I think, really has to make. Now, for the religious side, you can't argue people into being religious, I think. There is a religious argument, and that is an argument that one can make to American Jews and to American Christians about the special place of Jews, Judaism, and Israel in both religions. But for the non-religious argument, I think it is being made. What I'm suggesting here by time in Israel is that it's better to experience it than to be taught it. And the only way to really imbibe it, the first way is through family, what your parents teach you. But then it's your own life experience.
The only thing I want to say is that I think all of the arguments can be very powerful. It just seems that a very large number of them are essentially defensive ones. They respond to the criticisms of this one and say, no, we're not this, or it's not that.
Yeah, yes and no. I mean, this is part of a larger American argument, which is what do we think about foreign policy? Do we care, for example, Ukraine? Why do we care about Ukraine? Part of the argument is because Putin is an aggressor, but part of the argument is because these are people trying to govern themselves in their own country. Do we care about that? That's not defensive, really. Yeah, so and I think you can make those arguments. There are other arguments that are also not defensive, which are purely without democratic principles, let's say. Israel is an important, valuable ally. Iran is a terrible enemy of the United States, continuing with the death to America policy, trying to murder Americans in America. And Israel is an important ally in that, et cetera. So I think those arguments do exist.
I want to take 2 extra minutes
Sure.
of your time and squish two online questions together, because I think actually, strangely, they don't sound like it, but I think they are a little bit related. One was a question about what your research implies for Israelis who've immigrated to America. This is a huge.
Yeah, hundreds of thousands.
Hundreds, I think it's close to 500,000 is Israeli nationals who live in the United States. 99.9% in New York. No, I'm just joking. I'm just kidding about that.
No, many in California.
And in California.
And Florida.
That's true too. Are they at risk of becoming divorced from their Israeli identity? The other question, which comes from our Sahar, is how would you compare the level of Judaism between Ashkenazi and Sephardi Jews? Does one have a stronger relationship to the religion than the others? And the reason I said they're related is because actually Israel is now not a majority Ashkenazi, but in fact a majority Sephardi country.
Well,
so
on the latter question, I have not seen any data on this. So all I can give you is impressionistic evidence. Impressionistic evidence is yes. That is, that Sephardic Jews have a stronger Jewish culture today. Now, maybe this is because of immigration patterns. That is, they may be more recent immigrants, right, certainly here, whereas Ashkenazic Jews started coming here in 1880 in large numbers, and it was mostly over by the First World War. Whereas, say, Syrian Jews, for example, are post-World War II. Iranian Jews, post-World War II, and maybe they'll all assimilate too, give them another generation or two. But I think there is a stronger practice of the religion, for example, of respect for Shabbat. I'm sorry, the first question was...
About Israelis living in America.
Israelis, yeah.
What about, are they at risk of this dissociation as well?
It's really very varied. Some Israelis come here to live, to escape living in a small and in many ways beleaguered country. Others come here for employment or education and go back. The question, I guess, and I don't know the answer, the question about that number would be not how many Israelis are here, but how long are they here? Because if the answer is, well, a lot of them are here for a PhD, or they're here for a 5-year stint on Wall Street, or in Silicon Valley, and then they go home, that's a great thing. If they stay here, then they're just a generation away from assimilation. I have a friend, acquaintance, who is a financial guy and came and lived in the U.S. with his little kids, and was here for about 5 years. They weren't so little at the end of the 5 years, and one day his daughter came home from high school with a very dear friend of hers who was a Korean American. And he told me that he said to his wife, "This is absolutely normal, predictable, and we're going home." So that, they've got to make a decision. I think, it's hard to criticize. Israel is a pressure cooker. Taxes are very high. You will be in the reserves and fighting until I think it's now 45. And you can see why someone would prefer to live in Palo Alto. But I hope they all go home.
Yeah, well, a lot did on October 8th, so and
yes.
that was a good market
I would
signal.
just we're running out of time. Just one short story about George Shultz. George Shultz was the head of Bechtel, and then he was nominated by Reagan to be Secretary of State. And the thought was, Bechtel, all their business is in the Arab world. He's probably anti-Israel. And that conversation took place in the American Jewish community and in the Senate when he was up for confirmation. He was asked, do you have any connection to Israel? Do you know anything? And he told the story of a graduate student of his, brilliant student, as he told the story. And then came the, I can't remember, it was 67 war, 73 war. And of course, he dropped everything and went home to fight. And he was killed. And Shultz said in his testimony, I didn't know that much about Israel. I thought to myself, look at this young man with the most promising future here. And he just instantly dropped everything and went home to fight. What kind of a country inspires that? What is it about that place that leads him and so many others to do that? Shultz, of course, as Secretary of State, had numerous occasions to visit Israel, then and after. And whenever he did, he was in contact with this man's family.
Really?
Yes, and I saw this myself, decades later. He remained in contact, he knew them. It was, it's a remarkable story about George Shultz, but also it's a reminder about this extraordinary country, Israel.
And on that note, I asked Elliott if he wanted to bring books or bring a bookseller along, and he said, you all know how to shop on Amazon, so go shop on Amazon, and thank you to you all, and thank you to Elliott.
Thank you.